Well, as the hours count down to the weekend's federal election, China has hinted the outcome may be an opportunity to reset frosty relations with Australia. But China's security deal with Solomon Islands, of course, kept regional security and foreign policy front and centre almost throughout the campaign. So does much separate the two major parties, and who's best placed to manage these at times rather delicate relationships? Graeme Smith, Fellow at the Department of Pacific Affairs at ANU and co-host of the Little Red podcast, and Stephen Howes, Director of the Development Policy Centre, join us to talk through these rather tricky questions. Good to have you both on the program, just days now from this important election. Graeme, let's start with you and the relationship with China. How well has the tougher stance against China worked for the coalition?
Well, if you mean in an electoral sense, we'll see on Saturday. There's certainly the looming presence of the election, I think, certainly has made their tone in many respects a lot more bellicose than it might have been normally. And electorally, we'll see. In terms of the relationship itself, obviously, we're kind of at our lowest ebb, but we have a new ambassador in town, and he's all smiles. He's a guy called Xiao very different to the grumpy ambassador that we had before him, and he's promising a reset after the election. But, of course, that isn't just up to him.
And that reset, do you see that being whoever wins government, that they are seeking that reset?
Well, look, I think we'll know they're serious about a reset when, say, for example, our ambassador in Beijing starts to have people pick up the phone to him. It's all very well to have a change in style, and certainly Xiao Qian is very open. He's been meeting as many people as possible as he can over the last few months. And certainly he's been very active in meeting the opposition and business leaders and trying to get, I guess, people on side to take a softer approach to China. But, you know, if in China itself we don't have access to their government, then there's not really been a reset.
Stephen, in your view, who would be best placed to provide that recalibration with China?
Well, Beverly, I think I'm going to defer to Graeme on that. I'm not really a China expert as such. I'm more familiar with the Pacific region and I guess China's role in the Pacific. I'm happy to talk about that. I think there is a lot of overreaction to China's behaviour and this agreement with Solomon Islands. I think it is somewhat a storm in a teacup. It's very rarely mentioned that China's had a similar, in fact, a broader security agreement with Fiji, for over a decade. So I think that overreaction we've seen on both sides, and that does need, I think, to be addressed. We have to be more realistic about the role of China in the Pacific and expect and accept that China, as a growing power and indeed as a superpower, is going to have a prominent role in the Pacific. But in terms of, our relationships with the Pacific itself, I think there we're seeing kind of healthy competition now between the two parties and this greater sensitivity to China's greater presence in the Pacific is leading to the Pacific, which it used to be not that long ago, a pretty niche and marginal area. The Pacific is now getting a lot more policy attention from both parties. We saw that in the election campaign, and we do see them sort of coming up with new and quite innovative proposals, on how Australia can deepen and improve its relationships with the Pacific.
Graeme, I'd like to bring you back in there. The Solomon Islands China Security Pact was very contentious, and it raised the whole issue of national security as an issue that's not normally an issue during election campaigns in Australia. Do you agree with Stephen that it was overblown?
Look, I think both political parties, were playing it up more than possibly needed to be the case. It is different, though. I think when Fiji signed those agreements in 2011 and 2014, China was a different China, and the world was in a very different space. So while, we haven't seen the final version of the Solomon's agreement, what concerns me about that, as opposed to the Fiji agreement, is you can see with the Fiji agreement, it hasn't been made public, but a lot of people have seen it, that it is hammered out equally between two sides. The Solomon's agreement looks very vague. It looks if you like, almost hastily cooked up. And there's a lot of wiggle room that you don't see in the Fiji agreement. And like I say, it's written in different times by a different China with, a lot more military assertiveness than you would have seen in 2011.
Yeah. Stephen, yes, go.
No, I just, respectfully offer a different view on that. I mean, obviously China was different and our relationship with China was different 10 years ago, but it's the China today that has that security agreement of Fiji. And I mean, the one commentator who I understand has actually seen both of those documents, in fact, rates the Fiji agreement as much broader than the Solomons agreement. And I think it's just that the Solomons agreement was leaked, so there was a lot of attention on it, and that, it came up during the election campaign. I think those are really the reasons it's generated all this hype, rather than the sort of any substantive difference between the two agreements.
And Graeme,
Stephen, I'm sorry. I'll fess up, Stephen. I've actually seen both as well, and I will respectfully disagree with your friend on that. The Fiji one is very specifically about police cooperation. It doesn't have a huge military aspect to it, and I guess Fiji, in some ways, you see this in its interactions with China. It is able to push back. Whereas the Solomons is a situation where, it's naturally dependent on China because it exports 60 times the value of products to China than it does to Australia, for example. Its economic dependence on China is far higher than Fiji, whose main export partner is the United States. So, the ability of the Solomons to push back is much less than Fiji. And having seen both agreements, I have to say the Solomons one alarms me a good deal more.
Yeah. Stephen, you've argued that, in fact, there's room for both Australia and the US alliance as well as China. With China's changing dynamic, are we really equal players now?
Well, I think what I've seen a lot of is people asking the question, like, could Australia have done something to stop China signing this agreement, however dangerous you think it is? Could we, for example, if we'd given them more aid, or if we'd done more on climate change, would that have changed the outcome? And underlying that is this premise that it's an either-or outcome. It's either us or it's China, and that's just not the case. We have a security agreement with Solomon Islands. Solomon Islands also has a security agreement with China. It's not that we've torn up our security agreement because Solomons has signed one with China. In fact, as soon as that agreement was leaked, what did Australia do? We offered more aid to Solomons. So Solomons and the other Pacific countries really see it as a both-and outcome, not as either-or. And they know that by reaching out to China, not only can they get more assistance directly from China, but also they can increase their leverage with regards to Australia. Yeah, so I do think we have to be realistic and not think that in these areas we can block China out. That's not how the Pacific sees it.
Graeme?
Look, I'm in furious agreement with Stephen on this point. You can't do strategic denial in development assistance. It's foolish, to put it mildly. We should be looking for ways, as we have in the past, to work with China and to, in many ways, to make their aid as complementary as possible. And, when you look at the people on the ground, for example, Li Ming in the Solomon Islands, he's fairly open to working with other development partners. So it doesn't have to be this game of, everything China does is a threat to us. There's no particular threat in building a stadium for the South Pacific Games, for example. It was going to be built anyway. Happens that Chinese contractors are building it. And still, the multilateral banks and even Australia often favour Chinese contractors to build their infrastructure because they do it quickly and they do it cheap.
All right, let's just talk about the US and the fact that it's pivoted back to the region. That may not last, though. Trump's expected to seek another term. Joe Biden could lose the Senate majority in the mid-terms. How much can Australia count on them in terms of the Pacific and how strategic it has become? Stephen, take that first.
Well, I can only comment on the Pacific Island region, not on Asia more broadly. But yeah, I think on the Pacific Island region, in a way, the US arrived too late. And I think that's going to remain the case. They are going to look largely to Australia to prosecute their interests in the Pacific. And so I think part of the job Australia has is also to communicate this message to the US that it's not a matter of keeping China out. And I think, again, this all the hype and concern around a security base being established in the Solomons is linked to a global narrative. That the US is worried that China's going to set up another security base on the African coast. And so that, since they're so sensitive to this issue, that gets communicated to us. So, yeah, I think we have a job to do, to keep good relations with the Pacific, but also to keep the US well informed and to keep their expectations realistic as well.
Graeme?
Yeah, again, in agreement with Stephen. I mean, there are really two types of US administrations we're talking about. There's the civil administration that is increasingly chaotic, and there is the military administration. They used to be called PACOM, now they're called Indo-PACOM, and they're going nowhere. They are here in a military sense. They have a huge corporate memory, unlike civilian government, and they know the Pacific, again, unlike, say, the State Department that has only just started to throw resources at understanding it. And Trump won't change that. Trump is not about to pull the military out of the Pacific. So yeah, in at least the military sense, the US aren't going anywhere.
Yeah. So to both of you, which party do you feel is better prepared, better able to manage this sort of strategic shift for Australia and its relationship with China? Stephen?
Well, I'll comment again just on the Pacific, and then Graeme can probably take up the broader relationship with China. But one thing that's impressed me is in relation to labour mobility in the Pacific, which is featured prominently in this campaign. You might think, well, what's that got to do with China and security? But I think, giving more aid is not the answer to the Pacific. The Pacific's already the most aid-dependent region in the world. But if we want to be better integrated with the Pacific, we want the Pacific to be better integrated with us, we need to provide more opportunities for Pacific Islanders to come to Australia. So far, we've done that on a temporary basis. You can come for a few months to pick fruit, or now you can come for a few years, say, to work in an abattoir. But I think Labor made a very important announcement in the campaign to introduce a Pacific integration visa, and that would actually provide permanent migration opportunities for 3,000 Pacific Islanders a year. And that would really expand the Pacific diaspora, which is very small in Australia. That'd be good for the Pacific. And that would be good for Australia, and it would be really good for our relationship. So, as I said, I think both parties are competing for ideas to take us further with the Pacific. That's a good outcome of these security concerns. But I do want to highlight and commend Labor for this sort of breakthrough idea of a Pacific integration visa that I think really could transform our relationship with the Pacific Islands in a very positive way.
Yeah, absolutely in agreement with Stephen on that. I think one way New Zealand differs from Australia is that it is a more Pacific country than we are. It does have a Pacific electorate. They have a Pacific foreign minister, which, is something you can't imagine in Australia in the near term. And if in the long term, we actually start to think about the Pacific in terms of being a force in the electorate, then that will naturally shift the way our politicians think about the region and the way the region thinks about us. In terms of the broader reset with China, I think having a less bellicose defence minister would definitely help things. That, I think, has been wrapped up in the context of the election. But I don't think there's going to be a huge difference in the way the two major parties approach China. There's been an attempt by the coalition to kind of make this an issue, but what unfolded in the Solomons kind of made that backfire for them. Yeah. National security should be a bipartisan thing. It's very dangerous when you go down a different path, and hopefully post-election both parties can put that behind them.
Graeme Smith, Stephen Howes.
Just before...
Yes, go.
Sorry, before you finish, Bevan, just to give some numbers to what Graeme was saying, the Pacific diaspora in New Zealand is about 9% of the population, and in Australia it's 1%. I think that tells you the difference.
Tells you the tale. Great to talk, Stephen and Graeme. Appreciate you joining us, and it really interesting times that we've had these discussions so profoundly throughout this campaign. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks to you both.
Thank you, Beverly.